If you would have asked me 5 years ago what the on-trend brewing thing would be in 2021, I never would have guessed that hard seltzer water would be so popular. Laugh all you want, but hard seltzer is a fantastic day drinker and likely isn't going anywhere in the near future. Imperial Yeast's new seasonal strain, W04 Paramount, can help brewers get the most out of their seltzer fermentations. A clean and aggressive fermenter, Paramount will produce an excellent seltzer with low fusel alcohols, and it's produced in a gluten-free medium. If you've tried making seltzer with standard ale or lager strains, you know the struggle, and Imperial Yeast is here to help with W04 Paramount. Check it out at imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. In 2020 and 2021, wildfires in the Pacific Northwest impacted the U.S. domestic hop crop. Shortly after receiving their 2020 and 2021 lots of hop varieties, brewers started to share anecdotes about hops that smell smoky and beers brewed with those hops that also smell smoky. Since that time, hop growers, distributors, and brewers have all been interested to learn how wildfire smoke impacts hops. I'm your host, Cade Job, and today in the lab I'm speaking with Brandon Sandoval from Colorado State University about a study he performed looking at how different sources of smoke might impact hops. Now, wildfires move through different ecological regions like grasslands, forests, and in the worst case through cities and towns where building materials are burned, which raises the question, do different source materials like grass, trees, building materials, do those different source materials produce different smoke qualities? And if hops are exposed to that smoke, how are they impacted? So to that end, Brandon cold smoked some Cascade and Centennial hops with different source materials such as grass, trees, building materials to see what impact different types of wildfire smoke might have on hops. He looked at whether there were differences in smoky compounds between the materials and even found a couple of new compounds that might be of future interest for study. So we'll talk about his findings, talk generally about wildfires and smoke and hops, and also share some of the research from the wine industry, who's done a lot of research with this over the last decade. So it should be a fun episode. If you haven't yet signed up to become a patron, please consider doing so. By becoming a patron of Brewlosophy, you get awesome rewards like access to Brewlosophy contributor recipes that we've never published, new discounts each month to YakimaValleyHops.com, and for $3 a month, access to a monthly live Q&A session with a special guest from the brewing industry. So last month's guest was the Brew Lab's resident sensory scientist, Jeff Daly. So if you missed the live version of his Q&A, you'll have to head over now to patreon.com/brewlosophy to sign up. And once you've contributed at that $3 level or higher, you'll get access to the previous sessions via the private patron Facebook page. So check it out at patreon.com/brewlosophy. I want to say another big thank you to everyone who's left a rating or review of the show. If you haven't yet left a rating, I'd love for you to do so. Every rating and every review helps us improve the show. I read them all and I love hearing before. As I've said before, we wouldn't have the Applying the Science episodes if not for listener reviews. So if you haven't yet left a rating or review, please take a moment to help us out. All right, feedback this week is from listener Danny. He says, been listening to your show since the beginning and always intended to send you a message. As I gotta say, your deep dive into brewing came along at the perfect point in my brewing education. I'm one of the many brewers that started out in lockdown. I loved any IPAs and figured I would give it a go. I'm a go big or go home kind of guy. So it started with a lot of internet reading, YouTube, and of course podcast. I fixated on Brewlosophy because it struck a chord with me. The experimentation was the foundation that built a better understanding of everything beer-related, styles, process, biology, and ingredients. Being hungry for information, I reached a point where I wanted more in-depth understanding, but found online technical articles and papers just too big of a step. I needed an intermediate media, and fortunately, the Brew Lab started. It captured very in-depth subject, but with a layman's twist that was great to innovative subjects to focus on. For instance, the yeast starter episode with Maria Mutsoglu was inspirational. Anyway, brewing-wise, I still love light IPAs and hazies, but in 2021, I joined the UK Norwich Amateur Brewers Club, shout out to the NAB, who educated me in beers I hadn't even heard of. In fact, yesterday I brewed a lambic. I'm intending to rebrew every year and blend to eventually make a goes. Having a group of people to give you educated feedback on your beers is invaluable and improved my brewing significantly. I gotta say to anyone listening, if you're brewing alone, stop and reach out to your local homebrew club. If it's anything like the NAB, you'll get involved in brewing for beer festivals and running competitions, all with involvement from established professional breweries. Before I wrap up, I just want to say I never miss a show and think the Applying the Science edition is great. Both the Brew Lab, Brewlosophy, and Martin's new YouTube channel, The Brewlosophy Show, are great, and to show my appreciation, I finally committed to giving a little back through Patreon. Felt right to support you guys, so I hadn't considered the extra content, but what a great bonus that's turned out to be. Anyway, keep up the great content. Well, thank you, Danny, for that awesome positive feedback. That's hopefully many of the listeners that are listening to this show share that same experience with you. And I'm glad that you've listened, and also glad that you've signed up to be a patron. So thank you very much for that awesome review. All right. In just a few seconds, I'll be back talking with Brandon Sandoval about smoky hops. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Rev up the savings at JCPenney's Power Penny Days. Starting Wednesday, wrap up huge deals like Home Expressions Quick Dry Bath Towels, only $5. Stock up on fresh lineups of tees and tanks. Women's styles start at $9, and kids' thereabouts tees start at $7. Plus, bring home extra bling. Yes, please, lab-created gemstones, only $13 while they last. JCPenney, make everybody count. Offers valid on select styles 410 to 414. Power Penny deals excluded from coupons. Other exclusions apply. See store or jcp.com for details.
My buddy Kyle here is going to help me tell you about Corteva
and
the power of
and
You see, Intrepid Edge insecticide combines fast knockdown
and
lasting residual activity for proven results.
And
it has 2 modes of action that deliver effective control against robbing insects, like leaf miners
and
armyworms
and
corn borers
and
loopers.
and
Oh, lunchtime. Thanks, Kyle.
And
visit intrepidedge.corteva.us to learn more.
Wildfires in the Pacific Northwest are increasing in frequency and severity, which is a challenge because 95% of the U.S. hop crop is grown in the Pacific Northwest. There are several research groups looking into how smoke affects hop quality, and Brandon Sandoval is one of those researchers from Colorado State University, and he's here with me today to talk about smoke and hops. Brandon, welcome to the Brew Lab.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk about it. So wildfires have been impacting the hop crop in 2020 in Oregon, 2021 in Yakima, and 2022 in northern Idaho. And thankfully, there were no major fire events in 2023, but we still had that whole Canadian wildfire that impacted a huge portion of the United States. And this really illustrates the frequency and severity of the problem that we're dealing with when we talk about smoke influencing hops.
Yeah, definitely. I remember 2020 in particular, out here in Colorado, at least, we were getting, some smoke from what became our largest wildfire in state history. That was really close to Fort Collins, where we are. And we were also getting some of that blowover from the Pacific Northwest as well. So it was a particular year.
Yeah. A lot of people in Oregon still talk about 2020 like the smoke blotting out the sun. There's pictures of like the sun just being red, like you could look up at the sun and not hurt your eyes because it was just covered by smoke in the Willamette Valley. It's crazy. And just a few months ago or a few weeks ago, Texas had one of the largest wildfires that it's ever had in its state history. So it's crazy. Like we're hearing, Colorado had a largest wildfire in 2020. Oregon had the largest wildfire in state history recently. All of these states are having more and more troubles and impact from smoke. But more particularly, the ones that we're worried about mostly are, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, where a lot of the U.S. hop crop is grown, and there's not been a lot of research. In fact, there's been very, very, very little research, and I think there's still only one published paper, which was by Stacy Williams and Justin Alexander, which is a method for detecting smoke taint in hops using GCMS. But there's been really nothing else that's been published. So I'm pretty excited to talk to you about your research today, looking at smoke and hops and how some of the different source materials might influence smoke taint. But first, I want to introduce you. So you're a graduate research and teaching assistant in Dr. Jessica Prenny's lab at Colorado State University, and a master's student with an expected defense in a few months, I guess?
Actually, at this point now, I've already defended and my thesis has been accepted. So I am finished now. I'm just kind of, waiting for the next step.
Well, cool. Congratulations. That's big news.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, how did you become interested in studying smoke?
Well, I was doing undergraduate work in Dr. Prenny's lab as well. And I made a friend and she was doing her master's research in hops. And in my undergrad research, a lot of the, literature review and everything, I ended up doing a lot of reading into smoke taint of grapes for wine. And that's what I did my project on. And that's how I first came to meet Stacy Williams over there at New Belgium. And so my friend that was doing hops said, this is also a problem in the hops industry. It's just not a lot of people are doing it. A few people are talking about it. And she really gave me that idea. It was like, well, I guess, if there's not anything going on there in terms of research right now, maybe we can start trying to build a little bit more of a foundation there.
Yeah. Yeah. Who is your friend? Do I know her?
You may or may not. Her name's Cade Nishaka.
Oh yeah, Cade Nishaka. Yeah, I had her on the podcast talking about.
Oh,
that.
There you go.
Yeah. She used to work at Odell's, right? Mm-hmm.
Yep, that's her.
Yeah. Well, cool. So, that's awesome. So that got you sort of pointed down the road of smoke and hops. And, again, the point of your research, at least as I understand it, was to just sort of understand how smoke is impacting hops, looking at both how different source materials and then also doing a little bit of sensory on just smoke tainted hops to see, is smoke actually impacting the quality of hops? And as we'll get to throughout the show, you cold smoked some whole cone hops with different source materials like grass, trees, and building materials, which I'm really interested to see how that one came out. And then you measure the smoke compounds on those hops and then perform some sensory analyses on a different set of smoked hops. So let's first talk wildfires. I mentioned in the lead-in that wildfires are increasing in severity and frequency. And of course, we talked about 2020, 2021, and 2022, but how serious of a threat is wildfire smoke exposure to hops?
Well, I want to be careful not to raise any alarm bells. I don't think anybody should be afraid of purchasing their hops from the Pacific Northwest. It's still, some of the best hops you can get, and we still have plenty of hops to go around. But, particularly with the wine industry, their main crop is the berry for their entire product. And just as these wildfire activities are increasing in our agricultural center of hops out here, I think it's probably better to get ahead of it, than it would be to just, wait until it really does become a problem. So,
that's a really good point, right? Hops, when we're talking about smoke exposure to wine, right? That's like the grape is everything. It's the whole thing. It's the whole product. Maybe the skins don't necessarily play a role in white wine fermentation, but the skins play a role even in red wine fermentation. So it's the whole thing. And if you get smoke exposure and it binds into the wine, it's 100% of the beverage. Hops are a really small percentage of the liquid volume of beer whenever we think about it, or even if you're looking at weight too, right? That's a totally a very, very small percentage of beer, and I think that's a really good thing to keep as a frame of reference, right? The hops that are coming from the Northwest, as Jeff Daly and Ryan Christian talked about recently, are still going through quality analysis, and they're trying not to release any smoke tainted hops. That doesn't mean that you're not going to get some smoke tainted hops, but the lion's share, the vast majority of the hops aren't smoke tainted when they're coming out of the Pacific Northwest. But still, in your episode or in your work, I understand like you gave some statistics about how burned acreage has changed over the years. Can you talk through some of that?
Yeah, so it's a EPA long-term study they did, and they basically took their wildfire severity between 1984 and 2001 and compared that to the years between 2002 and 2020, I believe. And they're showing, the states that have the highest increase in wildfire activity and intensity. And the Pacific North region, it's up there. I think I had mentioned it was in the top 5. Actually, Idaho, I believe, is number 6 in terms of increased wildfire activity. And I believe Oregon is number 2 or 3. And then Washington's right around there as well. So, it's becoming a bigger issue, and the data is pretty clear.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? That just in the last 20 years, what that essentially means is the annual burned acreage has increased in those states, and the states seeing the highest increase was Washington was the second, Oregon the third, and then Idaho just outside the top 5. But also California, Arizona, and Oklahoma are in there as well, which is kind of interesting, right? We're seeing this kind of like West Coast burning. Oklahoma's more in the central, but the West Coast is kind of on fire.
And just anecdotally, the differences I've seen, when I was growing up in Southern California in the 90s, California is just kind of known for having, wildfires as part of their ecology out there. And it seemed like we used to have wildfire season, maybe like every late fall or early fall, there would just be all these plumes that you'd be able to see from these different regional fires that were just massive. And it seems to be happening nowadays just at any time of the year. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's happening. And I mean, especially during fire season, which is like late September, sometimes August, even creeping into July at this point, which is prime hop harvest season, which is tough. That's really tough for growers, especially whenever they're kilning the hops. Right. Because if you think about like pulling all of that smoky air and blowing it onto the hops, it'd be interesting, to see how that it has an effect and if it has an effect on hops. But you mentioned the wine industry already, that they've been studying grapes and smoke taint for almost 20 years, and even across the pond, way across the pond over in Australia, they've been doing a bunch of work looking at how smoke is impacting wine grapes. How is it that the hop industry is really only now looking into it in the last few years?
Yeah, my main speculation to this has probably been for one, just the location, like these areas, like in California and Australia, they've been battling wildfires for a long time, and they've been watching it, get worse. Again, going back to grapes being the main product that they have for their entire liquid. But really, if you look at the economic value of the two crops, so for instance, I think it's Wine America released some values, and apparently the grape crop is the largest valued fruit crop in the U.S. with production. I think last year it was valued at about $6.5 billion with roughly 1 million acres of grape production. Now that's all grapes, including table grapes and wine grapes. But if you compare that to the U.S. industry, which is valued at just over $500 million, and there were roughly 60,000 acres, I think, being grown last year. And 20 years ago, we had half that acreage in hops.
Yeah, for hops. Yeah. Roughly 60,000 acres of hops grown last year. Yeah, that's true. That's a really good point. 1 million acres versus 60,000. That's a lot smaller in terms of the acreage. And again, as we talked about, the usage in beer is also small too. I also think too, this is totally just me speculating as well, but that 2020 wildfire, especially in Oregon, I mean, it hit Yakima too. So it's not to say that Yakima wasn't impacted, but especially in Oregon, I think that really brought brought into sharp focus for a lot of people. Like, whoa, okay, this could actually be something that impacts hops. And then, of course, there were a lot of smoke-tainted hop lots, right? There's some smoky citrus, some smoky mosaic, some smoky Eldorado, a bunch of different varieties got smoke-tainted and actually, smelled smoky and or translated smoke into the beer, at least anecdotally. So yeah, I think this was kind of like, whoa, okay, wake up. Maybe we actually do need to deal with this, instead of just, kind of wait and see what happens. Maybe we should look at the wine industry. Now, I wanted to ask, a little bit about what the wine industry has found in terms of smoke. But maybe before we do that, I wanted to talk more specifically about wildfire sources. And so wildfires obviously don't always burn the same source materials. They might be grassland or forest-based, or in extreme cases, if they make it to like cities or towns or developments, the building materials might also get burnt. And has there been any research looking into how those different source materials influence smoke quality?
Yeah, I did find an older paper from about 23 years ago, and they were analyzing just the volatile compounds from different source materials. A lot of common household items, so like cushions from your couch, foam, mattress, gasoline, things like that, things that might be found in your garage. And it was to better understand the impacts for firefighters, like what kind of fumes are they going to be breathing in? But that was an interesting concept, I thought. And then especially thinking, just is the interface between civilization and nature, just becomes so much more blurred. You're always going to have kind of a bouquet of fuel sources, I guess you could say. And in 2021, in December, out here in Colorado, we had what started as a grass fire overnight. It was just one really windy day, and overnight, over 1,000 homes burned to the ground. Ooh. So yeah. So this isn't just limited to beetle kill up in the forest or anything. This just happens.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Pacific Northwest is hugely foresty, and that's generally where most of the forest fires in the Northwest have been isolated to. But it's like you say, homes are getting evacuated all the time because they're close to fires, and then wow, 1,000 homes burning overnight. I mean, that's huge. So it seems like then that source materials might have some influence then on the quality of the smoke or how the smoke impacts different things. So now I want to sort of transition over into like smoke and how they might affect hops. But again, since we've talked a lot about the wine industry, I think that's the natural place to start. So what are some things that the wine industry has found that might be important for hops, or that might explain how smoke would impact hops?
Yeah, so it's interesting because, obviously wine or grapes and hops are completely different morphologies, chemistries, completely different products. And they've found different, they've done a lot of different studies on things like the maceration process with the red wines versus, the white wines, both being smoked at the same time. They've looked into how it can be translocated just by, smoke compounds being brought down to the soil with the rain, and then just moving up through the plant's body and into the berry. And they've also identified a lot of good markers that we can use to in our analyses and to detect whether or not there is smoke in there. So there's a few key compounds that are really indicative of smoke that are responsible for the characteristic aroma of smoke, like guaiacol, for instance. That's kind of like the granddaddy of all the smoke markers that you'll see in every smoke taint related paper. So, in thinking of how it might impact grapes, the thing about grapes is you might not even be able to tell until after you've already made your wine, because a lot of times these compounds will attach themselves to sugars. And when they do that, they're no longer volatile until either the enzymes in our saliva break them up or they get broken up through the fermentation process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because like the grape itself. Well, first of all, those compounds, right? Glycol and things in that range. There's also 4-methyl glycol, the cresol, syringol, some other compounds that are important to the wine industry and sort of indicative of hop flavor, or of smoke flavor, I should say, or smoke aroma. But they are volatile, right? That's aromas, it's smells. That we're talking about. And you're right. It seems really interesting that this wine grape sort of the way that the smoke interacts with the wine, it binds to glucose. So wine is a huge sugar source, right? Think about eating a grape. It tastes really sweet. Even wine grapes, even, though they're sometimes more sour or tart than like a table grape, there's still a huge amount of sugar in there. So the smoke binds to that sugar and then becomes no longer flavor or aroma active. So you can't smell it. But then, like you mentioned, in your saliva or during fermentation, boom, suddenly you've got smoke. So hops aren't a huge sugar source, right? They don't have necessarily all this like ability to glycosylate or bind to glucose. Does that mean that hops aren't susceptible to smoke taint, or how might hops be different, and how might smoke impact them differently than grapes?
Yeah, that's one of the questions, and that's why I think it's worth, kind of starting, maybe not necessarily from square one, but kind of redoing some of this grape research in hops, because yeah, you're not going to have so much of that like glycoconjugate factor. You're going to have a lot of free volatiles. So how are these being represented in hops? Are they just sticking to the to the dermal layers of the hops? Are they somehow, interacting with, lupulin and everything in there? And yeah, it's just interesting to see how it might be expressed. One advantage we might say is that it's likely that we can detect, smoke taint right off the bat without having to, stick a grape in our mouths or ferment the product.
That's a really good point, right? There's a new upcoming ASBC method about doing smoke sensory in hops that I think is hopefully getting released later this year. But that's true, right? I mean, you can open a bag of hops that have smoke taint and they smell smoky oftentimes. Now, that's not to say that that's the only way that you can test, or that they don't also smell smokier after fermentation or any of that. But that is lucky, right? It's not like grapes. I've heard anecdotes from the wine industry, because the Oregon State Wine Group is doing a whole bunch of research into smoked wine, and they tell me all the time, yeah, you can mash these grapes, you can go through the whole process of harvest and mashing them and smelling them, and they don't smell smoky. You can put them in your mouth and they may not even taste smoky when you straight put them in your mouth. They might if they're super smoked, but then you put it in the fermentation and let it sit, and boom, it's like you can't even drink it. It tastes like somebody put a fermented or poured wine over a whole bunch of cigarette butts. It's the way I've heard it described. And that sounds disgusting. And certainly being a part of a bunch of smoky wine panels, I can say it tastes disgusting too. And so hops might exhibit those poor aroma sensory qualities if they're smoke tainted, which might then translate into poor sensory or smoke taint in beer. But like you mentioned, there might also be some changes in chemistry, right? Are the smoke compounds interacting with lupulin or interacting with oils or other things? And then also there's this thing too that has been discussed a lot, which is cloud cover, or well, let me say this backwards, or the right way. Hops actually need a lot of sunlight. It's kind of one of their defining characteristics as a plant. So whenever smoke is in the atmosphere, it's reducing the amount of sunlight that the plant is getting, which might reduce yield and which might change other chemical characteristics of the plant. So maybe it's not even smoke taint, binding directly with the plant, but the actual loss of sunlight or exposure that the plant is having out in the field. All this is really cool. And so back in episode 61 of the show, I talked with Stacey Williams and Justin Alexander about their method for analyzing hops via GCMS. And I won't go into all the details of that, but they were able to identify those compounds that you mentioned earlier, glycols being like the big granddaddy of smoke in hops. So are these the compounds like glycol, 4-methyl glycol, cresol, syringol? Are these the compounds that you looked at in your study?
Yeah, so the difference between mine and theirs was they did a targeted analysis, so they knew what they were looking for. They were going for those tried and true smoke markers. And I just want to say, I couldn't have done this study without them and without Stacy helping out with the method and running the samples and everything like that. But yeah, we doing a non-targeted analysis using the same methods that they were using. We were able to find, all of those same compounds. They found the M and P cresol particularly. I think O was just kind of hard to distinguish between others. And then 4-methylguaiacol and guaiacol. I was able to see all of those as well using the same method in a non-targeted way. And one of the things I think is a benefit to a non-targeted study is, for one, you get a broader range. You're able to see a lot more because you're not looking for specific things. But it's also just a little bit less input, and it makes the whole process just that much faster. And I don't know, for some reason, I think speed is probably a good thing to have on our side when we're, in harvest and looking at hops.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, especially as growers are wondering, like, what do I do right now? Right? What do I do today? Do I pick these hops while it's smoky? Do I not pick these hops? Hey, it's smoky outside. I kiln these hops. Are they Are they smoke tainted? It gets to the grower, or gets to the distributor. The distributor opens up a bag for quality check and needs to make sure that they can send out that lot. Yeah, speed is key for the growing industry. So I think that is a really, really important part of this. Well, walk me through then your study design then. So you did a non-targeted approach. Walk me through what you did to the hops. Then we'll take a break and come back and look at the results.
Yeah, great. So I took two really common publicly available cultivars, and so I was wanting to do this in situ, like with building an enclosure, but I wasn't able to get my hops in the ground early enough that year, so I had to source them. So what I did was I just did a little benchtop experiment where I got a culinary smoker, and as you said earlier, I collected a bunch of different types of material that I used individually. So one was to simulate a pine forest, and this kind of recipe for the wildfire simulation was adapted from some papers that had done similar work in the grape industry. So I did. I tried to simulate a pine forest, a deciduous forest, grassland, and then, as you mentioned earlier, building material as well. So I burned all of those individually, a consistent amount of fuel, and I just kind of let them sit. And it was only about a 15-minute exposure that I gave these. And then I loaded up my samples and took them over to New Belgium, and they fortunately ran these for me over the weekend. And yeah, so the method that we use, it's called solid phase micro extraction. And it's really great because when you're doing a non-targeted analysis with this, all you need to do is add some salt water, add some of your ground up product, and then boom, you're ready to throw it through your instrument. And so we did that method, but then we also did a complementary GCMS run where I actually went through a couple of more sample prep steps. That way I could get a look at some bigger compounds, what we would call semi-volatiles. And yeah, and then I was able to, kind of go through and, annotate my data and unlock the secrets.
Yeah, and see what you can get, and see what the different types of building materials actually what those might impart to hops. So cool. Well, I'm excited to see the results. So let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and check those out. The new Brewbuilt X2 Unitank conical fermenter is here, and it's ready to take your brewing game to the next level. With the best interior finish, welded and polished ferrules, clear bottom chamber, pressurizable with body connect fittings, etc., Brewbuilt has managed to bring commercial level features into the homebrewing world at an unbeatable price. Now available with a professional grade glycol jacket, giving you a more sanitary environment and much greater cooling efficiency, say goodbye to clunky immersion coils with the game-changing jacketed X2. Visit morebeer.com to learn more.
Before Shopify, were you wondering, where are my sales at? Now you're selling with Shopify, the global commerce platform supercharging your selling. You have no problem selling online, in person, on social media, and beyond. Gary, easy on the cha-ching.
Oh, sorry, but my Shopify sales are through the roof.
Start selling with Shopify today and discover how millions of businesses around the world use Shopify to ignite their selling. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/listen. Shopify.com/listen.
Rev up the savings at JCPenney's Power Penny Days. Starting Wednesday, wrap up huge deals like Home Expressions Quick Dry Bath Towels, only $5. Stock up on fresh lineups of tees and tanks. Women's styles start at $9, and kids' thereabouts tees start at $7. Plus, bring home extra bling. Yes, please, lab-created gemstones, only $13 while they last. JCPenney, make everybody count. Offers valid on select styles 410 to 414. Power Penny deals excluded from coupons. Other exclusions apply. See store or jcp.com for details.
My buddy Kyle here is going to help me tell you about Corteva
And.
the power of.
And.
You see, Intrepid Edge insecticide combines fast knockdown,
And.
lasting residual activity for proven results.
And.
It has 2 modes of action that deliver effective control against robbing insects, like leaf miners,
And.
armyworms,
And.
corn borers,
And.
loopers.
And.
Oh, lunchtime. Thanks, Kyle.
And.
Visit intrepidedge.corteva.us to learn more.
Despite the fact that wildfires have been occurring for decades and that the wine industry's been studying wildfire impacts on grapes and wine, the brewing and hops industry hadn't started investigating smoke in hops until recently. There's now a lot of research in the area and even a new forthcoming ASBC sensory method, as I mentioned previously, for assessing smoke character in hops. Brandon, do you think that smoky hops are all bad? Is there a place for smoky hops in beer?
That's a really common question that I've had people ask me. And, I think it's possible. I love, smoky beverages and we all love smoky food. You kind of got to think about it as like the right sensory characteristic for the right place. So, I like the smell of gasoline, but I don't want to smell it in my bedroom or in my coffee,
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it's just kind of one of those, there could very possibly be a market for this. I think of, ales a lot of time might have more of a caramel kind of rich flavor when you're dealing with, different malts. So who knows, if somebody wants to play around with making a desirable smoky hopped beer, I think that would be interesting. I would try it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would try, certainly. I'd try it. It also sort of raises the question is, are these compounds actually making it into beer, right? We're using hops at small amounts. Well, maybe not dry hops and Whirlpool editions. If you're just dumping, dry hop and Whirlpool edition, like several pounds per barrel or I've heard even like 10 pounds per barrel. This was like, whoa, that just seems like a crap load of hops to add, and a very expensive beer. But if you're doing those kinds of things, maybe it does actually come through in the finished beer, but that's still a question that the people are going to need to answer at some point in the future. And now one other caveat too, I just wanted to remind listeners that you were talking about Brandon's study where you intentionally smoked some Cascade and Centennial hops, and these were performed on kiln dried and whole cone hops. So this was after they had been processed. You're cold smoking them for about 15 minutes using different source materials, grass, 2 different kinds of trees, and then also building materials. So just wanted to remind listeners of the study design and also mention that these were already processed hop cones. So they hadn't been in the field. They weren't done through kilning or any of that stuff. I don't think that ultimately changes the results too much. Just wanted to remind everybody. All right. Now you did a non-targeted analysis, and let's start with those first 5 compounds that Stacy and Justin looked at. Did you find those in the hops?
Yeah, I did. So I was able to detect guaiacol, 4-methyl guaiacol, and MMP cresol. I believe those are 4 of the compounds that I was able to see. Yeah. So I think another one that they looked at might have been O-cresol. Yeah, that one's kind of hard to distinguish just between 2 of them. So yeah.
Yeah. Some of those cresols the cresols are very similar shaped, right? They're basically the same mass, just in a different organization, like a different spot on the ring.
Yeah, you've just got one of your subgroups. It just changes carbons. It just goes around the ring.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, which would make it hard to distinguish between those three. But so, first of all, that's a pretty big takeaway, right? So we did find in hops that you were smoking here across, well, I guess I should ask that question too. Did you find it across all of the treatments, across all of the smoke materials?
Yeah, overall, you were able to find a lot of these. I think P. cresol was probably one of the weakest in terms of detection. But yeah, the guaiacol, the 4-methyl guaiacol, M. cresol, I believe we were able to see over all of those as well. Yeah.
So that's pretty interesting. That's kind of a big takeaway. First of all, like the smoke compounds that the wine industry is looking at and that Stacy and Justin had previously looked at, you're finding those in all of the different smoke compounds. That's kind of a cool takeaway, especially for future research that's looking into smoke or people that are trying to develop faster methodologies for, identifying smoke taint in hops. You found this across all different sources of smoke materials. That's cool. That means that there's at least some set of compounds that are similar enough that we might be able to look for those compounds and analyze our hops, right?
Yeah, definitely. Now there was some to quite a bit variation between the fuel site types, but yeah, in terms of like detectability, we were able to see it.
Yeah, cool. And I wanted to dig into that too, like some of the differences between the fuel types. I just wanted to make that key point here that like it's pretty cool that these compounds exist in all types of smoke. But let's talk about the new compounds that you saw, or rather maybe not new compounds, but compounds that were different between the treatments.
Yeah, so the one that varied the most between all treatments, I would say, was furfural. Now I know I've heard, I'm not a beer scientist, but I've heard that that's a compound that can be found in beer a lot of the time. But that one significantly varied between every single one of our treatments. The highest was in the building material, followed by the deciduous material, and then grass and the pine. So that was an interesting result to see. And I don't want to jump ahead on you, but there was a novel compound that we saw that hasn't been detected in or reported in smoke taint literature, to my knowledge, and that one was clearly the most abundant in the building material.
What was that one?
So that's a xylopyranose.
Okay.
So that's it's a I believe it's a 5-carbon 6-member ring structure of xylose, and it's a major component of xylan, which is part of the hemicellulose fraction of hops, of woody material.
Huh. Interesting.
And I think the reason why we might have found it so abundant in that is that the recipe of wildfire that I had used was for the woody samples. It was green and brown material and some bark. We used bark because that's what previous studies had done. But in the building material, we were actually using, like studs. So that was Douglas fir sapwood. And a previous study that I read, their results suggested that your hemicellulose fraction is going to be higher in a coniferous sapwood than you will find in the bark or in grass material. So I think that could have been a reason why we saw such a high abundance compared to the other treatments.
Interesting. So furfural and xylopyranose were showing differences between the treatments, which is, I think, really interesting. So furfural, and I don't know actually how to say it, but that was one. I'm doing some quick Googling while you were talking about it. According to like the AI generated search term, furfural is a Maillard reaction, and it may be one of those aldehydes that might ultimately be related to beer staling, which is kind of an interesting thing. thing, right? So this is like, okay, maybe it's going to add a little bit of like stale aroma. And then that xylopyranose is allegedly, it has a smoky odor that tastes, quote, smoky, sweet, salty, and coffee-like. So very interesting that these compounds are also in there. So maybe these compounds are not only describing differences between the different source materials, but maybe different impact or aroma characteristics to the hops that are smoked with different source materials.
So I think that's one important distinguishment to make, is that, whether or not we find these attributes desirable, you can kind of think of it like wine. You've got a kind of wine you like, you got a vineyard you like, you've got different years you like, and things like that. But is this product true to type? And when we start adding these other attributes, if it comes forward in our Cascade hops, well, we're probably going to be able to pick that out really easily.
Yeah. Do you think this is interesting too? Do you think there would be differences, or I guess I can ask you this question since you looked at Cascade and Centennial, were there differences between like hop varieties themselves in terms of the, concentrations of smoke that you found, or like the different chemicals?
That was a little hard for me to distinguish. There was a few confounding variables, one of which the Centennials that I treated, at the point of treatment, they had experienced a bit more shatter than the Cascades had. So, there might have been more surface area being exposed there. But I think that I think that would be a good next step, is really to dive deeper into like how these are varying between cultivar.
Yeah. And I guess, another thing that might have compounded that too is, again, you're putting the smoke on, the already processed hops, so it might just be like, you're adding the same amount of smoke to the hop material. So it might be very similar between the two. Whereas like if these were out in the field, or if they were during kilning, like you said, they might have a little bit of different, shatter. They might have different morphology. They might have, different ability for smoke to sit. They might have, if they're on the vine, like they might have different leaf or other green material that's protecting or shielding some of the cones. Any of those things could play a role there, and certainly reasons for or subject for future study as we get into this again. And it is important to admit, or to say, like, this is one of the first studies that's looking at smoke and hops too. So we don't have the answers to all of the questions, which is really cool from a scientific perspective, because you do this study and then we start to ask, okay, what are these next questions? What's the next thing that we could do? How does smoke flavor change the beer? How does it change the hops? All of this different stuff. And so I would sort of ask this question, is kind of like, what does this tell us about different source materials for wildfires and how that might impact hops? Like, what does your research tell us about those things?
I would just go back to saying, wildfire smoke is complex. A lot of times, we have an overabundance of maybe one type of material, but there are a lot of different factors to consider when you're thinking about what is making up this wildfire. And then, as you had mentioned earlier, like what's the weather around the times that these wildfires are happening too? There are different mechanisms through which that they can get inside of plant material. Like I said before, if it's being rained down in through the soil, if it's just sticking. Also, at what growth stage is the plant being impacted, and can that impact, any production of our desirable compounds within the plant material?
Yeah, totally. That's a really, really good point too, because the plant itself is changing as it's out in the field. I think Ryan Christian said this on that last episode where I talked about wildfire smoke and hops. And he was like, a plant, like a human, if there's smoke, we can just drive away and go to a different area, but the plant can't move. It's stuck, right? So it's still got to breathe. It's still got to grow. It's still got to do all the things that it needs to do to survive. It still has to have access to sunlight, for example, and it can't move. So it's just stuck there dealing with the smoke. And so one of the questions is, how is the plant physically dealing with the smoke? That's really cool. And again, I love this research because it does show us sort of that there may be differences in smoke materials that and the way that that smoke gets to the hops and impacts the hops, which might result ultimately in sensory or aromatic or chemistry differences, which is pretty cool. Were there any cool other interesting findings from this portion of the study, or should we move on to the sensory part?
I think, being able to identify a compound that, as I said, to my knowledge, hasn't been identified in any smoke taint research, whether it be wine or with hops, that was kind of exciting to see, and I'd like to look further into that,
Yeah. Right. To see like what that compound is and what it does and how it, how it impacts hops, how it got there, where it came from. That'd be a fun one too. Right. How did it get into the building material one, but not the other ones, not the other three? That's really
definitely.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, there's a whole another branch of research too that's looking at just how, like you said, like how the hemicellulose and how the other pieces of lignin break down whenever they're burned and create different smoke compounds. So that's a whole other area of research that we're not going to go down that rabbit hole today. But you also did a sensory assessment piece of the study. So tell us about what you did in terms of the sensory piece of this study.
Yeah, so I had grand visions when I was planning this out, and I got to say it was a great learning experience.
I love that euphemism. That's great.
Yeah, but fortunately, I've been in contact with Jeff Daly and Tiffany Petra, and they've been working on various methods for describing smoke taint and hops through sensory analysis and some other intricacies for doing those studies. So I decided I would test some of those ideas out. So we took some hops that were provided to us by Yakima Chief from the 2020 growing season with varying levels of smoke reported at harvest, which was kind of a subjective reporting level, different people just with their own opinion, like, oh, this was a mildly smoky day, or this was a very, very smoky day. And we selected a few out of there. We tried several different cultivars, developed a quick crash course training session for our panel, which consisted of 10 individuals. And then over a few different sensory sessions, we had them just kind of rate, the intensities of these different aromas based off of some experimental smoke standards that we use.
Oh, interesting. So these are samples from Haas and YCH that were sort of independently identified as smoke affected samples.
Correct. Yeah.
And so not the ones that you intentionally smoked in your study.
No, we didn't include any of those in there. This was strictly the real world samples.
Yeah, sure. Dang, that stinks though. I wish we could have had some sensory there on those studies. That would have been fun.
Oh, me too. Yeah. No, that would definitely be the next one I would do.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. So you, I guess, did you just not have enough sample that was there to not be able to do the sensory study, or?
What it was, asking 10 different people to do a favor for me that lasted several days. That's just hard. But also, I was advised by, friends in the industry that have been working with this kind of stuff is to not overwhelm a brand new, what we would call it, consumer panel. So I had to be really selective with the standards that I chose, whether it be hop aroma standards or smoke standards, and then also trying to figure out which samples to use and which samples to exclude. I only gave them a total of 6 different samples, and they tried those same 6 samples, which they didn't know they were the same, over the several sensory sessions.
Sessions. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So what hops were used? What were the 6 samples that you used in the study?
Let's see. I believe I used Citra, Centennial, Mosaic, and did I use Cascades? No, I didn't use Cascades. I think I used a couple of different Centennial samples. So that's where like the math comes in.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I see. So a couple of different varieties, or a couple of different like samples that may be like intensely smoked, not as smoked.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Awesome. So then you said it was around 10 people that were on the panel.
Correct. Yeah. I had 10 people that I gave like I said, a quick maybe 30 to 45-minute crash course. And then we just got right to work.
Okay. Yeah. So that crash course is like smelling through some different aroma standards and smelling through some hops. Like, here's what you might find. Here's what these things might smell like.
Exactly. So yeah, I guess to run you through the training, first I kind of described, what we were doing and how this typically works in the industry. And then I, for the sake of time, I decided to make it almost hypnotic in a way. So I would put a picture of like a fruit basket up on the projector, and while everybody was smelling their fruity aroma standard, I would say over and over again different descriptive words that might describe that aroma standard. So that was to try to get everybody on the same page of this is what this aroma is, and this is how I can describe it.
I see. So how many different descriptors did you have?
So I had 4 hop aroma standards from the typical kit you get. I think it's Barthas. And then I had 4 experimental smoke standards. And then I gave them 1 sample of smoky hops that I smoked just using like apple wood chips, just to give them an extreme example of what a smoky hop might smell like.
I see. And I see from the notes here that it was like citrus, sweet fruit, floral, and herbal were the hoppy standards. And then you had beef jerky, a burned corn chip, charred twine, and lapsang souchong tea for your smoked standards. I wanted to sort of bring those up because hopefully whenever the new ASPC method is released, I'll have Jeff and Tiffany on to talk about that. And there's a lot of overlap here in terms of the standards that they're using in the ASPC method and what you used in this study for your standards. Okay, so if I understand then, you had 10 panelists, you run them through sort of a quick training on like how to smell through hops, what you should look for, and what like smoke might smell like, and then what the hoppy characteristics might how they might present themselves in the hops. So then what questions, when the panelists are actually doing their analysis, what did you ask them to rate or to give you? What feedback were you looking for from the panelists in terms of your smoky hop samples?
Yeah, so I made clear to them in the beginning that it wasn't a rating of good versus bad, or desirable versus not desirable. It was just strictly rating like, do you smell this, and do you smell it a little bit, or do you smell it a lot? I think I definitely would change my entire rating scale up if I did this again. But that's how we approached this particular sensory panel. So I also asked panelists, not to react verbally or physically, so as not to influence one another, and not to look inside of the jars at the samples, because some samples were really pretty green and some weren't. So I was really just trying to get the most objective just rating off of them.
Yeah, makes sense. And so then what did the panelists find?
Well, that was a really hard thing to kind of decipher as well, because I think of the rating scale that we used. But looking at I guess the annual like aroma attributes for some of those specific cultivars, we were able to see that it did appear that our panel was able to distinguish correctly desirable attributes, which was good. So that was just kind of a matter of testing their ability to accurately identify compounds. And it did appear that smoke aroma or smoke exposure was able to divert some of those samples from being what you could say would be true to type. And then finally, we tested a couple of different preparation methods, which I'm afraid to talk about too much because their paper hasn't come out yet. But one of the methods appeared to kind of bring forward more smoky notes than others.
Sure. And I think that's they've I think mentioned this before, so I don't think they'd be too mad at us for talking about it. But it's like one that's just regular hop grinds versus one that's in a slurry, right? With like either water and ethanol, something like that.
Definitely, yeah. That's what it is. So what we did was a 5% ethanol and water slurry. And the interesting thing about that is think about how hops are typically enjoyed in a 5% ethanol slurry. So
yeah, I mean, hop teas are a very common way to prepare things. I mean, there's an ASBC method currently out there for how to prepare hop teas for sensory analysis. So that's a very similar thing, I think, just adding in ethanol in this case. Okay, so sort of like the takeaway then is that yes, some of these smoky hops smelled smoky, and they had some of the similar attributes or the attributes that we're trained on, like smoky, like beef jerky, like chart twine, lapsang souchong tea. Panelists were able to distinguish and pick up some of these characteristics. So at the top of the show, then we were asking sort of some initial questions about hops and smoke, right? And one of those questions is, how does source material impact smoky hops? And then the other question is, do hops themselves smell or taste smoky from natural wildfire smoke? And that is sort of the big takeaway from this second half of the sensory project, right? Is that yes, these did smell smoky, at least to the 10 panelists that you had in your session. And so there is wildfire smoke is translating to hops.
Yeah. I would say confidently that it definitely is. If I could just say one more thing to the sensory panel, I'm really excited for their ASBC paper to come out, because one of the big limitations I was wondering is like, how appropriate is it to have like a basically untrained consumer sensory panel doing these things? So like I said, undoubtedly they were able to identify smoky hops, but I think I'll leave sensory to the experts from now on.
No, that's fair. That's totally fair. I mean, it sounds like the panelists in your study got some training, right? And you were able to, next time you'll refine the ballot and stuff and ask some different questions for them. But again, the initial foray off into smoke, and that was kind of the takeaway here, right? Is that these hops were smoky. I think even Jeff Daly mentioned it on the episode a few weeks back, where we were talking about smoke and hops and how they're flagging consistently, not in 2023, but in 2022, 2021, 2020, they were flagging hops as being sensorially smoky. So that means the smoke is making it onto the hops. And this is just another study that confirms that smokes is impacting hops. Which is cool. And I am excited to talk to Jeff and Tiffany about their upcoming method once it gets released and finalized and all that sort of stuff. So that'll be pretty exciting. Okay. So one of the big takeaways then for brewers is that, or at least a couple of big takeaways from this are that smoke materials seem to matter, that yes, hops can be impacted by smoke. There's different compounds in the smoke materials that might influence, quality and aroma. But I always ask this question of guests before the end of the show, and it's, if you want brewers to take away just one thing from today's episode, what would it be?
I think just from my experience, it seems like breweries and hop distributors and the industry are doing a really good job at working together to investigate this. And, through these investigations, inevitably we'll find methods of mitigation. And I think that it's important to just, let's not stifle progress by keeping secrets. Let's keep working together on this. Let's keep sharing our research, and we'll get through it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's one of my favorite things about the brewing industry is people sharing research and sharing knowledge across the industry. I mean, it just benefits the whole industry as a whole. And so every time we see a smoke research project, it's good to get it on the podcast to talk about what, one of the major challenges for the industry. I mean, like I said, Jeff Daly and Ryan Christian both just came on and talked about an entire hour about how this is a challenge for the industry and it needs to be addressed. And Brandon, now you've done a study that hopefully has some cool takeaways for brewers, growers, suppliers, all of the above. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to share about your study that we didn't get to today?
I think we about covered it. That was about the whole thing.
Well, great. Well, awesome. Well, I'm so excited to have been able to talk to you about smoke, and thank you so much, Brandon, for joining me in the Brew Lab.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Well, next week, Jordan and I will be back applying the science of this episode. See y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.
My buddy Kyle here is going to help me tell you about Corteva,
And.
the power of...
And.
You see, Intrepid Edge insecticide combines fast knockdown,
And.
lasting residual activity for proven results.
And.
It has 2 modes of action that deliver effective control against robbing insects, like leaf miners,
And.
armyworms,
And.
corn borers,
And.
loopers.
And.
Oh, lunchtime. Thanks, Kyle.
And.
Visit intrepidedge.corteva.us to learn more.